Too often, we follow leaders who have tons of charisma, but run low on good character. In some cases, these leaders become spiritually abusive. But how do they gain so much influence so quickly? Today, during part 2 of our series on spiritual abuse, we'll show you the 4 mechanisms abusive leaders use to create environments for abuse to thrive. But before we do that, we're gonna jump into part 2 of our conversation with Lara.
And again, this is a 4-part series. So if you haven't listened to session 1, go back and listen to that one first, because each session builds on the previous one.
I want to take a step back before things got bad. Before, when they were sort of like you said it, a little bit of poison in the water over time. Mm-hmm. Nobody notices it. Nobody got sick overnight, so it happened gradually. I think one of the things that makes spiritual abuse and any form of abuse, even if it's domestic violence or narcissistic abuse or is that it's never bad all the time. That's right. And so it's this yin and yang. It's this good and bad. And it's those good moments that allow the abuse to continue because it justifies or rectifies or even ratifies what it is that has happened to you. And it's so I want to hear a little bit about while you started noticing these drips. And I think that analogy, Lara, is so beautiful of just slowly poisoning the well and the living water. I think that is, what a powerful, I hope you listening and watching are getting to that, because that's such I couldn't think of a more accurate example of what I've witnessed. But throughout this, you're drinking the poison, but you are still seeing really cool stuff. And God brought you on some amazing journeys through that. Tell me about some of what was it like in those early days for you spiritually that you kind of felt like there's this awesome spiritual growth? What was some of those things happening simultaneously with you're also like, but something's slightly off? Tell me about some of that.
And it's so good to highlight that, because a part of me wanting to share is the hope of the restoration.
Yes, good.
Because again, like I said, this is not something that it's like when you're in an abusive relationship with, like a family relationship, when you're like, get out, don't ever go back. Well, this as a whole, when you think about God's family, like there are healthy families, and there are church families is what I'm referring to. There are,
that's good.
And they are so filled with rich jewels that God has for us that only you can get in these communities. To your point, when you're in a healthy church, and every church culture, there will be brokenness. That's helped me too. Just don't try to go in and find perfection. It's a broken culture. But what in those early times that I loved so much was the support and the I guess, like I said, the love. Like there was somebody cared for me.
Yeah.
Like I said, I spent most of my day playing volleyball, and I was around trainers and coaches and tutors all day long. But wasn't quite loved. I wasn't loved by them.
Right.
I was what I could perform for them.
Right. Conditionally.
Do for them. Right.
Yeah.
But then it was like I'd come home to a bag of groceries outside my door. Like when I was giving plasma, and I was on a full ride, but secretly, and I didn't want to ask my parents because they didn't have the money. So I would go give plasma after practice to get some grocery money. And this beautiful couple who was living on a missionary's budget, gave me 2 massive bags of groceries. It just was like, what? You must serve a loving God, because only that's where I see from your people. That's where you see the glory of God, is loving through action. So these things are still happening all around us in communities of faith. All around us. They're there. They're beautiful. Will you find a lot of mix of controlling behaviors and toxic stuff in churches? Yes. But it's like little wells around you. It's not the pure well of itself is different if you're drinking from that well.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's still there. For me, it was a very long journey to get to a place where I can talk even about this.
Yeah, I know.
Many that are listening are at some point in the real messy parts of this.
Yeah. because you went from, and I want to make sure I get my facts right, because you went from student being reached with the gospel on campus, accepting Jesus, to joining the community, to volunteering, to then becoming a leader,
Yes.
and then actually becoming a staff within this movement, right?
10 years.
And right, I was going to say, so a decade of time passed, right? So it wasn't
Overnight.
right. It wasn't like all of a sudden you woke up and you were like, "Oh, I'm in an abusive situation." Right? I mean, it was 10 years of your time of training, grooming,
Yes.
corrective behaviors.
Yes.
And during that time, if I understand correct, I mean, you had a chance to go to New York and do ministry. You did ministry around the world, all these sorts of amazing things happening. And the faith movement is growing, right? I mean, you're reaching lots of hurting and lost and wounded people. And so at some point you decide, okay, well, it's time for me to step forward. It's time for me to say once and for all, this is not okay abuse. And one of the things that I've encountered a lot, and I don't know if you've heard this, is, well, why didn't they, what was wrong with them? Why didn't they just put their foot down and say enough's enough and just walk out when they just could have left, But I want to talk about, why was it hard to untangle yourself? What made that so difficult that you weren't able to just be like, deuces, I'm going to go find another community of faith? I mean, what made it difficult for you?
Excommunication. Absolute excommunication of all that I've known for 10 years. And mine didn't come mine came with an acute, essentially, a trauma that happened, where that's what it took for me. And even then I was still kind of sticking around. And it came through just things that you would say, now that should have said, don't ever come near this well again in any form. And the thing was that this well had other wells it had planted, started. And so when I experienced the major one, it made me run to a smaller one.
Oh, wow.
But that water it was like
tainted. The
water at that point was already polluted, but it had planted a bunch of wells with the polluted water. And so where do you run? You're all that I knew across the US and even in Eastern Europe, in different places, they had those wells. And so it was like, well, the trust issue too is like the trauma happened because of such betrayal of trust that's when I first realized the waters were polluted. And the shock of like, wait a second, this is your waters are supposed to be clean. How is this happening?
Wow.
When you say excommunicated, do you mean that people were instructed to essentially shun you or cut you out?
Yes, multiple people had said that. Well, it's the second time I finally completely cut ties happened after another crazy trauma that happened but the first one was one that was where it's hard to understand, but I don't want to give any details, but there was slander, and nobody was then telling me of this event that happened, essentially communicated to the whole community something about me that wasn't true. There had been a couple lies that had been made up about me, and this whole community where I was believed it, and therefore treated me as if I've done these things. And then when I tried to get clarity for months, I was sent away. I was told I can't talk to anyone about it. They were told they can't talk to me about it. I was assigned a pastor from a different state to deal with me. Yet no one told me what was happening, what I'm being dealt with. What was said about me, I only learned later. But everyone was ignoring me and treating me as if I've done these things that I haven't, or I was this thing that I wasn't. So it's utter madness. And yet so I went, thankfully the Lord came to me in a dream multiple times to kind of help me walk through this, or else I would have been completely gone. I would not know what to do. Got severely sick after that. But I went to another state, essentially, to this other well, which then later I eventually got excommunicated. I chose to when this extreme thing happened that I was like, okay, I see it. This is not good for me. But
What was just today I met with someone and they were sharing how they had had a new pastoral team. They were a church plant, and they, without going into much detail, when they were going to be fired, they had them sign this letter. And this particular person worked in youth and led youth for a fairly large church. And on the letter, there was language that indicated that there was abuse of power and inappropriate behavior. And she was asked to sign this, and she said, like, this would ruin my entire career. Like, it makes me sound like I inappropriately touched someone. Like, I'm not going to sign this. Mm-hmm. And when she refused to sign it, they brought in people from another state, and then they wrote a new one up that said she was acting fully with insubordination, right, was this language. And I think that one of the things that we got to talking about, I'd be interested in, because you just brought up something that I want to touch on, which is this issue of authority. Mm-hmm. This issue of that word even. And I know I've talked to a lot of people who have spiritual abuse that even that word is now triggering to them to hear, because that idea of positional, spiritual, God-given, mandated authority creates a situation where it can become beyond toxic. It can become extremely difficult to even challenge and rise up against. And so was that an element of your story as well, this idea of authority?
Oh yeah. I was dealt mostly with because I challenged.
Yeah.
I bucked up against when there was things said about me, or all the calls I would get, whatever. I was like, that's not what I said. Or, like I would challenge. I was then even told, don't come to this meeting. Don't come to this. I'd have so many times the authority would come in on a meeting, girls' meeting.
Wow.
That I was doing for this conference, and would correct me in front of all these other women, really challenging my authority. But the thing about authority too is that, and in these spiritual abusive cultures, churches, is that, there is a lording over you. Mm-hmm. That is a key thing.
Wow.
They lord over you. Mm-hmm. They're in control. They kind of feed, and this is like that slow thing that's like, whether they know they do it or not, I don't know, but you can't correct them.
Right.
So there's like, either you can't, and I've tried, and others have tried. Those who lord over you aren't correctable.
It's good stuff from that conversation with Lara. Sometimes it feels almost like we're drawn to abusive leaders. There's something about their charismatic confidence that just calls out to us. And maybe it's as if a part of our flesh nature wants to be them, to have the fame, the glory, the respect, the authority, and the power, or at least to be in close proximity to all those things. And sadly, we usually aren't drawn to the best leaders. The best leaders, in the biblical sense, they're usually not the most visible ones, right? They're the ones quietly serving rather than elevating themselves or their message. Ironically, most of the leaders we choose don't end up truly taking care of us once they get in power. I mean, just look at Washington. It's a place where power and influence is everything, where sound bites and clever one-liners are valued more highly than character and substance, and where people are often just pawns on the chessboard. We follow politicians who we know are abusive, and yet we're still drawn to them like moths in a flame. That's a sad thing to admit. Character takes a backseat to charisma, and sometimes they end up serving their own self-interest rather than serving us, the people that they're there. That's their job. But that's just politics. Surely the church is different, right?
Right.
Our leaders aren't supposed to be concerned with fame and power and influence. And we aren't supposed to allow charisma to be a substitute for good character. We should choose godly leaders, not just gifted leaders, right?
That's good, Joe.
When churches begin to value the things of the world, when we forget about Christ's model of servant leadership, spiritual abuse is soon to follow. Instead of serving others, leaders often begin to serve their own interests of power, fame, money. And churchgoers may become those pawns that are used to serve an agenda that's opposed to the teachings of Jesus. And people get hurt in the process.
Wow. I mean, it shows how important it is to keep that front and center, that model, right? And I don't believe that many people get into spiritual leadership roles, rather, with the goal of abusing those people that they serve. Maybe they say, I just want to preach, or I just want to invest deeply in the lives of other people, or, whatever. But to be fair, I'm afraid that many of us also have unrealistic expectations of those spiritual leaders. We expect them to be wise, kind, approachable, loving, patient, and oh, by the way, super cool, thin, attractive, well-dressed, friends with celebrities. Like, we expect all these things all at the same time. I always tell people that if you plan on serving in your local congregation, be prepared to be let down by someone in leadership.
That's good.
But that doesn't make them an abuser. It makes them human. But some spiritual leaders let those character flaws combust into full-blown abuse. They may have began the ministry with a heart of service, but behind that virtuous calling was a carnal heart vulnerable to the same temptations that all of us face. A flesh that craves attention, one that loves to be in this seat of power, of authority. Or alternatively, one who may be even deeply insecure, seeking constant validation and approval. Whatever the case, there's often some crack in the armor, some vulnerability that Satan's going to use to exploit if he's given the right opportunity. And as this spiritual leader grows in influence, the opportunity to exploit those weaknesses or those vulnerabilities becomes so much more numerous. And there are these core mechanisms that abusers rely on to create cultures of abuse, mindsets or attitudes that are fostered within an organization that enable this abuse to be covered up and ignored. And our hope is that by understanding and learning to identify these core mechanisms, we'll be able to detect abusive actions and deal with them before they mature and cause even more significant harm. And I want to say this: if you're a person who's in a spiritual leadership role, whether a volunteer, maybe you lead a small group, maybe you're on the prayer team, maybe you're a pastor, maybe you're an elder or a deacon at a church, I'm not sure, don't be afraid to necessarily even search your own heart and say, are there any of these things maybe that I'm actually falling victim to?
Yeah.
Right?
Again, it's all in our human nature.
That's right.
It starts small.
That's right. So here are the 4 spiritual abusive mechanisms, or the 4 mechanisms, I should say, that create spiritually abusive environments. Positional authority, false teaching, isolation, and classism. So let's tackle these one by one to see how they play out. Jenny, why don't you get started with this topic of positional authority?
Sure. So positional authority is really the backbone of spiritual abuse. The power of the pulpit is very potent. Ooh, that's a hard one to say.
The power of the pulpit is very potent. She sells seashells by the seashore.
The power of the pulpit is very potent. Anytime we open our hearts to the words of another, there's a chance for us to absorb truth or falsehood, right? We quite literally sit under their teaching and we learn how to live our best life from these leaders. That is a position of immense power. The impact of their words and our trust in them grows even greater as their words strengthen our spiritual walk, right? There's good things that are coming. There's nothing wrong with learning under the tutelage of a spiritual mentor. In fact, I would say it's a necessity if we want to live a meaningful life and if we want to be impactful as Christians. With every sermon, lesson, or teaching, they earn our respect. But here's the difference. Spiritually abusive leaders demand respect instead of earning it. They use shame to persuade us to give up our time, talent, and treasures, even though we don't really want to. They bring correction and accountability to others, but they themselves are above correction. And they take the credit when things are going well, but they blame everyone when things are going poorly.
Wow.
They dismiss people when they no longer serve their needs. Yikes. And they protect their platform at all costs and are willing to lie to cover it up for the sake of the mission. And behind these attitudes and behaviors is a belief that they have been uniquely called and appointed to a higher position of rank and authority than the rest of us. Abusive spiritual leaders believe that God has given them a special role as an intermediary between common man and God. They replace the central character of Jesus with themselves. They become our teacher, our savior, and our judge. This positional authority gives them control over the lens through which the scripture is taught.
Wow. I mean, that is so big, to this idea that they become the intermediary.
Yeah, they are the leader, not Jesus being the leader.
And that they become our access point to
Right.
God the Father.
Right, that's
It's
a dangerous
interesting.
place.
And it's also Satan at its core, right? I mean, to try to become God, to try to become something that he could not be. And it's so easy to do, because nowadays it's not just that we're listening on Sundays, right? It's not just that hour. It's now we're listening to the podcast during the week and the worship
There's a
during
lot
the
of
week.
access points.
A lot of access points. Yeah. Now our second mechanism is this: false teaching. This is when this kicks into action. As they gain the trust of these people, let me say it like this. Gaining the trust of someone who is vulnerable is actually quite easy to do for a spiritual leader. I mean, after all, they have words from Scripture at their disposal. These words that are sharper than any two-edged sword. These are words that can cut right into the thoughts and intents of the heart. So pairing falsehood alongside of this truth is a great way to package up deceit. We think, well, that seems true enough, so we buy it all. Or that advice they gave me worked for my life, so surely this next piece of advice or criticism that they give me will work for my life. The false teaching begins to change the way, I should say, that we view ourselves and others. Cognitive manipulation techniques are used to make these false teachings more palatable. Now, in my background, I had the unique experience of spending several years in a pretty intense sales and marketing training program. And they taught us some phrases that you can use to sort of soften up the mind of the person before you're about to tell them some bad news. And they taught us, how do you kind of package things? So, for example, one of the things that we see is some of these same techniques that are used in that community are unfortunately used by these false or these spiritually abusive teachings. Let me give you some examples. I want to prepare you for what I'm about to teach you today, because a voice in your head's going to tell you that what I'm saying is wrong. But I want to invite you to move past that voice of fear and embrace what I'm saying, because deep down, you know that it's good for you. In other words, what did I really just tell you to do?
Don't trust your gut.
Don't trust your instincts, right? What this does is create dissonance in the mind that leads us to question our own critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
And certainly there are times when we must silence the voices of fear, but we should never silence the voice of reason. As it says in Corinthians 14, we are able to pray, worship, and learn with our spirit, but we're also to do so with our minds. Here's some other examples of things you might have heard. Now, what I'm telling you isn't my opinion. It's God's opinion. What I'm telling you isn't my opinion, it's God's opinion. Or, Evan, your pride is keeping you from submitting to my spiritual authority.
Yikes.
Or here's another one. Now, I don't expect you to understand this yet, but I know that God's word says blank. Now, in the hands of a truly loving and godly leader, these phrases aren't necessarily on-ramps for spiritual abuse, but I'll tell you what, in the hands of an abusive person, these are psychologically manipulative phrases that will detach us from our own consciousness and silence the discernment that the Holy Spirit gives us as a gift and a tool from the Lord. Disarming or disabling the critical thinking part of our brain is the goal of any false teacher, because get this, when they do the thinking for us, they gain control over us.
Wow.
And once they have control over us, they must limit that outside influence. Maybe pause for a second and just think to yourself, have you heard any of those phrases? Have people said things like that to you that sort of set the groundwork for them telling you something that maybe deep down you kind of knew wasn't true? How did you respond to that? How can we get better at recognizing this manipulative language?
Yeah, it just makes me think about the serpent in the garden. His question to Eve was, did God really say if you eat of this tree, you'll surely die? And he said, if you eat of it, you're going to be like God, knowing the good and the evil. So he was causing her to question what she knew to be true, and then dangling something better in front of her that was contrary to what the truth was that she had known.
And we live in an age where critical thinking is not as necessary as it once was. I mean, even by the time that a politician gets done with his speech, there's 90,000 talking heads telling us what we should be thinking about what was said. The same with sports events. I mean, we don't really have to analyze the games anymore because somebody's going to tell us what we should have thought about it. And so we're kind of predisposed now as a culture to outsource our critical thinking.
Wow.
Right? And when we do that, I mean, that just sets we're inviting manipulation into our lives.
Yeah. Wow. So this is where our third mechanism of spiritual abuse enters the picture, which is isolation. So the spiritual leaders convince us that others outside of this community won't understand us and couldn't possibly give us any better advice than what they could give us. We're taught to isolate, run away from the world rather than to reach out to it. And for cult leaders specifically, this means asking their followers to move into a commune. For others, it means practicing a different kind of control, like accountability that checks on every relationship or social activity. And that's so much easier now with social media.
Right. You know what everybody's doing all the time. Even if when you don't want to, like, I don't want to know what you ate for lunch.
And
I don't care.
And calls. There's so much visibility to our activities that spiritually abusive leaders could take advantage of. Now, certainly, Christians are supposed to live in a community and be held accountable for their decisions and their actions. But in abusive situations, people begin to make the decisions out of fear of man rather than being inspired to make the choices out of their good choices out of their love and commitment to God.
That's really good. You know what you just said a minute ago, too, they're taught to run away from the world instead of reach out to it. I mean, I can even remember some of that, even in youth group days, this idea of the world is corrupt, you need to stay away from it. And to some degree, that's okay. But to some degree, it's interesting how it can become so unhealthy.
Yeah. Sometimes this type of isolation can lead to what's called groupthink, which actually normalizes behaviors that would normally be flagged as irregular or immoral. We've seen this in cases where spiritual abuse turned into sexual or physical abuse. Members of the group have become so isolated from the outside world that they either don't recognize the abuse or they're too afraid to report it to the authorities because they've maybe given up so much to become a part of this community. They don't want to risk losing that. Groupthink makes it so that if the group we surround ourselves with approves, then we approve as well, right? So if the group approves of this action, the groupthink says it's okay, then we are inherently assigning our approval
even if the
to
group
that.
Doesn't say anything.
Right.
If the group ignores it, that acts as
Silence
approval.
is approval, right? Then we're going to be silent as well. And as the number of people in the abusive community grows, the leader can't keep tabs on everyone. So then they promote these like captains, additional leaders, to further propagate their influence. Now, this is where classism, the fourth mechanism of spiritual abuse, is deployed. We all want to be close to the guru. Remember, we talked about that earlier. We were kind of drawn like a moth to the flame. We want to be close to the wise teacher, the famous person. We want to be one of the few, the chosen with direct access to the insulated and unapproachable leader. And once you're in, man, you feel like you have arrived. You are a somebody. You were a nobody, but now you're a somebody because you're close to this person. It's almost like you can draft off their glory and experience a little bit for yourself. We're drawn to it. This desire to be in the inner circle is the bait, and once we're on the hook, it's really tough to get free.
It's good.
The allure of being in the inner circle can cause people to silence any alarm bells that may be going off in their heads about misconduct that they're witnessing. The cognitive dissonance we talked about earlier is still present, but in positions of second-tier leadership, the pressure to uphold the norm is even greater, right? Because now you have to live by what you have preached. It's so much more visible.
Right.
But don't get confused. Just because you're in the inner circle doesn't mean you can't be removed. Those who bring up legitimate issues are quickly labeled as enemies, doubters, and they're offered correction. The message is clear that questioning the leader's motives or actions will set you on the fast track out of the inner circle and maybe even out of the community altogether. And that's the most threatening aspect, because when you've been shoved out of the community, it's as if you've been shoved out of the Christian faith itself.
Wow.
Many of us associate the leader themselves with the entire belief system. Terms like church hurt or deconstruction start to become more relatable to someone who has been hurt by Christian leaders.
Wow.
Check out this stat. 9% of Protestants under the age of 35 who left their church did so because of spiritual misconduct. Now take a moment. Who do you know that has left the church because of church hurt? Why did they leave?
Yeah. And I mean, it might sound like this 1 out of 10 isn't a huge number, but that's not because they lost their trust in Jesus.
Yeah, which is
They lost their
Such
trust
a-
in his people.
sad lost opportunity.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you were one of those 10. And if so, I hope that you will continue listening to this entire series, because in a couple sessions later, we're going to be sharing how to get free, how to hopefully reconnect with God himself. And hopefully you'll give us the grace and chance to be able to work through that with you, because you are not alone. So I want to recap these 4 mechanisms one more time: positional authority, false teaching, isolation, and classism. That's how spiritually abusive leaders think. And that's how cultures of abuse flourish. Now, hear me on this. When leaders preface their opinions as God-ordained truth, people get hurt. That's because they're asking us to submit to their authority and interpretation of the truth rather than the truth itself. They're asking people to follow them, more importantly, than following God. In essence, they become an idol that we follow no matter the cost. They become Lord. They become master, and we become slave to that master. And spiritually abusive leaders treat us accordingly. Modern day leaders aren't the first to do this. In fact, this issue of misusing authority and manipulating spiritual language is something that Jesus himself had to directly address throughout his entire ministry on earth. So the good news is that we have direct wisdom from the mouth of Jesus, right, on this subject that we can pull right from his teaching. Words that not only bring correction to the abusers, but words that bring comfort and healing to those of us who have been abused. And that's going to be our next topic for the next session. We're going to discover exactly what Jesus says to spiritually abusive leaders. We're going to compare how he led versus how abusive leaders today lead. Now, if you're getting a lot out of this series and you want to keep growing, don't forget, we have created, as our gift to you, we've created a free online course. You can use it as an individual or as a group. It's 4 sessions. It's got a workbook. It's got all kinds of great stuff. You can get it on our My Reboot app, or you can go to your website, our website, my.rebootrecovery.com, set up a free account, and simply find the course titled The Great Cover-Up. And if you've been joining us for this, maybe you've missed some of the other episodes and you just tuned in today, I encourage you to go back and watch the others. But thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, as always, our universal message over here at Reboot on these is please keep moving forward as we overcome trauma together.